Welcome to Reflecting Light. This podcast is about filling the world with light by exploring myth, ancient texts, scripture, great works of world literature, and the works of artists, past and present, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. And now, here is your host, Mandy Green.
Hello and welcome to Reflecting Light. I'm Mandy Green. Lots going on. Good gracious. As I try to slow down, it seems that time speeds up. I was listening to a Hopi Prophecy today. Super interesting about the three great shakings of the earth. Now, to qualify that, I want to say that Hugh Nibley often commented that the Hopi ceremonials were right on or followed the ancient pattern. So when something that has Hopi in it shows up, I usually pay close attention. So it was talking about the three great shakings of the earth and how these great shakings are designed to have us, for once and for all, learn how to get along and include all of the nations or all of the colors, all of the races, and find peace at last. And the first two shakings didn't take. I'll give you the YouTube link if you're into this. It was really interesting that the first two didn't take, and the third great one is during the time we live. And the purpose of it is to bring us to each other and to at last teach us to have peace. Well, I've had some events happen in my life that have really made me think long and hard about how we treat other people. And to start off the discussion, I wanted to quote from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 through 38. And the Pharisees, having heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, that's the Savior, were gathered together the same way and questioned. Well, sorry, I'm reading from the Greek, so it's a little bit dicey, but just hang with me. One of them, a lawyer, questioned, testing him. And then he would say, "Teacher," which I think is pretty condescending, right? He doesn't give him the distinction of a rabbi or a proper title. It's just teacher. "Which commandment?" And remember that in tole, it's the word here used. It can mean which instruction is the greatest in the law or in the volume or in the gospel. Law is not even a direct translation. It's in the volumes, right? In what's written. Verse 37, and he said to them, "You shall love the Lord, the God of you," so the Lord your God, and the word there used is agape, meaning heavenly love, "with all of the heart of you, and with all of the soul of you, and with all of the mind of you." Now that alone is pretty heavy stuff, isn't it? All of your heart, all of your emotions. And remember that cardia could also, well, in this sense, the heart is what propels everything in your body. Once your heart stops pumping, you will die. And the heart is in the center of you, and it's what propels everything else, okay, physically. But we use it as a place of emotional, but anciently it also meant the place of knowledge, that your knowledge would be centered on the God of you. With all of the soul of you, this would be your body and your spirit, right? So there's two different ways right there that you would worship the Lord, the God of you, with your body and your spirit. And those are sustained in different ways. And lastly, with all of the mind of you, with every thought, with everything you think. Verse 38, this is the great and first commandment. The second, also like it, you shall love the neighbor of you as yourself. And the agape is the word used there too. And pleison is the word used for neighbor, and it means someone who is nearby. So we think of a neighbor as lots of different things, but it means anyone near you, anyone in your circle. And lastly, in verse 40, he says, on these two commandments, and entoles is instructions. It comes from the idea of a military command. So how you have to fight the fight, how you do the battle. So on these instructions, which also shows Jesus as the Lord of the Sabaoth, or the hosts of heaven. These are the instructions for how you battle. On these instructions hang all the law, or all the volume, all the gospel, and all the prophets. And hang can also mean depend. Well, agape is this godlike love. How does that show up, and how do we do it? Well, I'm currently taking a class with my church, and it's about answering tough gospel questions. We had a very, very in-depth discussion about LGBTQ. And I left that discussion. Now, normally I love the class. I've learned so much about going to great sources, about schooling my reactions, about doing my research, about looking at all the different sides of things. However, with this particular class, I left very, very unsatisfied because I feel we can do so much better, my friends. Just because you don't understand someone's point of view or their experience doesn't invalidate their experience. And we had a small breakout discussion group with many different people, and it was really interesting. There was a myriad of opinions and experiences, but one commentator said that she's a therapist and all she can see is a mortality rate that is unnecessary. And I would agree with that. There's a mortality rate there that reflects not understanding, that we don't understand everything about this, first of all, which was a sentiment echoed by someone else saying, we just don't know. We just don't know how this plays out eternally. We don't know the divine destiny of any of this. And all the more reason to show love. All the more reason to say, come sit with us, come be with us, come feel the Spirit. And I've been thinking so much about all of the things we accidentally or knowingly do to hurt each other. As the Beatles song says, isn't it a pity? Isn't it a shame how we break each other's hearts and cause each other pain, how we take each other's love without thinking anymore, forgetting to give back. Isn't it a pity? Well, during this discussion, in the previous week, we had been asked to study the principle of grace. Now, grace is an interesting thing in Christian theology because for different people, it means different things. Are you saved by grace? Are you saved by faith? Are you saved by works? Do you claim grace? All of these different things. But when we were discussing grace and the role it plays, I found myself finding one of the few references actually in the New Testament that actually uses the word charis or grace in Hebrews 4. And let me read to you the second definition. Well, let's read all of the definitions and then tie it back to our discussion for the week. It being the week of Valentine's and all of these expressions of love. When I think about the great shakings of the earth, I think about the judgment that we stand needing to fix in how we treat each other. It's also Black History Month. Plenty of opportunities there to learn more than you knew and to grow from that understanding and maybe learn from someone else's experience and point of view if it's not one that's native to your experience. So here is the definition for charis, Greek word 5485. Number one, grace, that which affords joy, pleasure, delight, sweetness, charm, loveliness, grace of speech. So I really like that first definition because it affords something. It's a precursor to joy, pleasure, delight, sweetness, charm, and loveliness. The second one is the one I really want to boil down on. The goodwill, loving kindness, or favor. And then the sub definition there, A, is this. And I think this is the grace that we all so desperately require. None of us makes it without this grace. The merciful kindness by which God, exerting his holy influence upon souls, turns them to Christ, keeps, strengthens, increases them in Christian faith, knowledge, affection, and kindles them to the exercise of the Christian virtues. My dear friends, I know that I depend on the goodwill, the loving kindness, and the favor of heaven, and particularly of Jesus Christ, in my own spiritual journey, that holy influence turns me back to him. It keeps me, meaning it protects me, it strengthens me, increases my faith, knowledge, affection, and kindles an exercise to Christian values. We are nothing without grace. Another great word in the Hebrew Bible is chesed, which is translated as God's loving kindness. Now remember, God is plural. The Elohim's loving kindness. A good friend of mine defined it as what every loving parent wants for their child. That applies to each of us, first of all. The most important person to love first is yourself. But then in all of this chaos and all of the events of the last week, it was really interesting to me that I had a really wonderful brother-in-law pass away. Great example of someone who afforded grace to others, who was never quick to jump in a fray or a fight, but was quite patient in suffering and quite patient with others. And reflecting upon him and reflecting upon how we treat quote unquote others, thinking about this idea of how we apply grace to our brothers and sisters. How can we extend our merciful kindness, exert souls to turn to Christ, to keep them, to protect them from these harsh things, to strengthen them, to increase their faith, and let them work it out with heaven. It isn't for us to judge. It isn't for us to call the shots. I do not have heaven's insight. I do not have heaven's eternal perspective, and I do not know how these things play out. I do know that things have happened in our world and in our history that are unkind, that are not about grace. And I think it's time for us to right the ship. Helen Keller said, although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. My dear friends, may you take this invitation to love yourself, to love God, to love the Elohim, plural, and then as prompted, to let this beautiful grace act upon you in your interactions with others. And even, I think the most important exercise of grace can be that we just give people space. We give people a moment to figure stuff out, and that we aren't over there throwing sin and burden and unhappiness and torment and unkindness on them. We've got to learn how to love our neighbor as ourselves to the degree, in the Greek, the degree that we love ourselves. Well, hopefully we love ourselves. If you don't, start work there. Start to know how grace has seen you through. Look for all the ways grace shows up in your life. And as you start to become familiar with the principle of grace, Look for ways that it shows up in your interactions with others. And perhaps you can be a spokesperson for grace. Perhaps you can be someone who loves others in the spirit of heaven, in the spirit of the Elohim. That is my wish and prayer for all of us this week, that we can extend grace, we can extend space and time, we can suspend knowing everything for sure, because we really, really don't, but that we can spend all of that and exercise grace on behalf of someone else. After all, that's what the Lord does for us. And I think it's a great exercise for us to come and know Him better. Wishing you all love and light.
Thank you for joining us for Reflecting Light with Mandy Green. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a good rating and share it with your friends. And remember, your light makes the world a brighter place. Share it.